Ma'am, step away from the house right now. Let's go.
I'm getting my mail. What's the problem?
I said move back to the street. I'm not going anywhere. This is my house. Ma'am, don't argue with me.
Look, Vanderbilt Medicine, that's my name, Dr. Marcia Chambers. You see it?
Stand by in that front door. I walk through it every day. I live here. Dispatch, hold one.
Officer Marcus Delano had served with the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department for nearly 5 years. In that time, he had accumulated a personnel file that should have triggered serious internal review long before it ever did. 7 formal complaints, every single one centered on the same troubling accusation that black residents had no legitimate reason to be present in predominantly white neighborhoods. A middle-aged man jogging through Belle Meade was stopped and interrogated about his home address. A young woman riding her bicycle through Green Hills was detained on suspicion of casing properties. A retired schoolteacher trimming hedges in her front yard in Forest Hills was demanded to produce identification proving she lived there. Each complaint followed an identical trajectory through the department's disciplinary system, mandatory sensitivity seminars that Delano attended with visible resentment and clearly never absorbed. His supervisors signed off on the completed training modules. His file remained active. His patrol assignments continued unchanged. On one particular Saturday morning in Nashville, this pattern of presuming that black Americans could not possibly belong in wealthy areas finally collided with someone who had spent over 3 decades building an unimpeachable place in precisely such a neighborhood. That collision would ultimately destroy Delano's career in law enforcement, cost the city of Nashville $3.2 million in settlement payments, and expose a police department that had systematically ignored 7 nearly identical complaints spread across 5 years of documented misconduct. A black woman in her early 60s stood in the circular driveway of her well-maintained colonial-style home, sorting through a stack of envelopes she had just retrieved from the mailbox mounted beside her front gate. The morning light caught the silver in her closely cropped natural hair. Her hospital identification badge still hung from the lanyard around her neck, evidence of the early morning rounds she had just completed. No crime was being committed, no laws were being broken, no suspicious activity was occurring, just a physician collecting her weekend mail at the residence she had owned for 14 years. But Officer Marcus Delano perceived something entirely different when he observed this scene. His vision was filtered through assumptions so deeply embedded that he could not process the image of a black woman as a legitimate property owner in this exclusive enclave. The possibility that professional success and substantial real estate holdings might not be bounded by the racial categories Delano unconsciously enforced simply did not register in his understanding of the world. He could not conceive that the person he was about to confront had infinitely more right to stand on that property than he had to question her presence there. If you have found your way to this video for the first time, I want to ask you to consider subscribing before we go any further. The stories we tell here matter because they expose truths that powerful institutions would prefer to keep hidden. Your support allows us to continue this work of bringing accountability to light. Now, let us return to Nashville and understand exactly how this confrontation unfolded. Nashville, Tennessee, the Whitland area, a historic district renowned for its stately residences dating back to the early 20th century. Streets lined with mature oak trees whose branches interlaced overhead to form cathedral-like canopies of green. Property values in this neighborhood reflected both the architectural significance of the homes and the social prestige attached to the address. The area remained predominantly white, conspicuously affluent, and quietly protective of its exclusive character in ways that residents rarely articulated directly, but consistently enforced through their assumptions and their phone calls to police. The time was approximately 9:15 on a Saturday morning in early October. The air carried that particular crispness that arrives in Middle Tennessee when summer finally releases its grip. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were practicing their Sunday repertoire. A few neighbors had emerged to collect newspapers from their driveways or to walk small dogs along the immaculate sidewalks. It was the kind of peaceful weekend morning when the loudest sounds were birdsong and the occasional passing car. Nothing dramatic typically occurred on mornings like this one. Dr. Evelyn Chambers had practiced pulmonary medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center for 32 years. 3 decades of diagnosing complex respiratory conditions, performing bronchoscopies, managing ventilator-dependent patients in intensive care units, and training the next generation of specialists. She had earned her medical degree at Meharry Medical College, completed her internal medicine residency at Duke University, and pursued fellowship training in pulmonary and critical care at the University of California, San Francisco. Her curriculum vitae included over 60 peer-reviewed publications, multiple teaching awards, and service on numerous hospital committees. Her patients placed their lives in her hands during their most vulnerable moments, when they could not breathe, when their lungs were failing, when mechanical ventilation was the only barrier between them and death. Her colleagues across the medical center sought her expertise on their most challenging cases. Hospital leadership considered her one of the most valuable physicians on staff, not merely for her clinical excellence, but for her mentorship of younger doctors and her tireless advocacy for patient care. Evelyn had grown up in Nashville, the daughter of a postal worker father and a nurse mother who had worked double shifts at the old General Hospital for 25 years. She remembered her parents' sacrifices with crystalline clarity, her father delivering mail through summer heat and winter ice, her mother coming home exhausted at midnight, only to rise again at 5 in the morning. They had pooled every spare dollar into an education fund, determined that their only child would have opportunities they had never known. She had not disappointed them. Full academic scholarship to Fisk University, admission to Meharry's medical school on the strength of her undergraduate research, match into one of the most competitive residency programs in the country, fellowship at a world-renowned institution on the opposite coast, then the return home to Nashville to build her career at the same medical center where her mother had once emptied bedpans and changed wound dressings. The poetry of that return was not lost on Evelyn. She thought of her mother every single day she walked through those hospital doors. 14 years ago, Evelyn had purchased the house on Whitland Avenue, a graceful colonial revival with white columns, black shutters, and a wraparound porch that reminded her of homes she had admired in magazines as a child. The purchase price had been substantial. She had paid it in full, writing a single check drawn on savings accumulated through decades of 90-hour work weeks and intentionally modest living. The house represented everything she had worked for: security, accomplishment, a beautiful space where she could finally exhale after days spent holding life and death in her hands. Her neighbors had welcomed her with varying degrees of warmth. Some had brought casseroles and genuine smiles. Others had maintained a polite distance that carried undertones she recognized from long experience. Over the years, she had fielded comments that revealed assumptions operating beneath the surface of cordial conversation. Surprised that she was a physician rather than a nurse. Questions about whether her husband, she had no husband, had purchased the home. Speculation about family money that might explain her presence in this particular neighborhood. Evelyn had developed strategies for navigating these microaggressions. She chose her battles carefully. She focused her energy on her patients rather than on neighborhood politics. She reminded herself that she had nothing to prove to anyone, that her presence in this house was legitimized by the deed bearing her name and the decades of work that had earned every square foot of it. That Saturday morning, Evelyn had arrived at the hospital before 6 o'clock to round on several patients in the pulmonary intensive care unit. One patient in particular had worried her overnight, an elderly man with severe pneumonia whose oxygen levels had been fluctuating dangerously. She had adjusted his ventilator settings, consulted with the night nursing staff, and remained at his bedside until she was confident he had stabilized. By 9:15, she was satisfied that her patients were in good hands for the day and ready to head home. She had pulled her silver sedan into the circular driveway at approximately 9:10. The morning was too beautiful to waste, and she had been planning to spend a few hours in her garden before the afternoon clouds rolled in. But first, she wanted to retrieve the mail that had accumulated over the past 2 days while she had been consumed with a particularly complex case at the hospital. She walked to the decorative mailbox mounted on a stone pillar beside her front gate. The gate stood open, as it usually did during daylight hours. She was wearing the clothes she had put on for early morning rounds: comfortable slacks, a soft cotton blouse, sensible walking shoes. Her hospital badge still hung from the lanyard around her neck, the photograph clearly showing her face above the words Vanderbilt University Medical Center and her title, Professor of Medicine. She opened the mailbox and began sorting through the contents: medical journals, utility bills, a fundraising appeal from her college alumni association, a catalog from a gardening supply company. the ordinary detritus of a professional life. Arriving at the home she had owned for 14 years, she had every legal right to be standing exactly where she was standing. She owned this property. Her name appeared on the deed filed with the Davidson County Register of Deeds. She paid property taxes that supported the very police department whose officer was at that moment turning onto her street. Officer Marcus Delano was responding to a call that dispatch had relayed as a report of suspicious activity. The caller, whose identity would be protected by departmental policy, had reported seeing an unknown black woman in the driveway of a residence on Whitland Avenue. The caller had expressed certainty that this could not be the homeowner, as the caller believed the property was owned by a white family. The caller had suggested the possibility of a burglary in progress, or perhaps a trespasser casing the property for future criminal activity. Delano had responded to the call with what his supervisors would later describe as enthusiasm for property protection. This was, after all, his specialty: patrolling affluent neighborhoods, investigating reports of suspicious persons, ensuring that expensive homes remained secure from criminal elements. He had been assigned to this particular patrol area for the past 3 years, and he had developed what he considered to be a keen eye for people who did not belong. The problem was that his determination of who belonged and who did not belong was shaped by assumptions that had already generated 7 formal complaints, 7 separate incidents in which black individuals going about their lawful business in predominantly white neighborhoods had been stopped, questioned, detained, or confronted by Officer Delano based on nothing more than their presence in spaces he believed they had no right to occupy. The first complaint had come 18 months into his tenure with the department. A black attorney visiting a client's home in Belle Meade had been approached by Delano, who demanded identification and questioned whether he had permission to be on the property. The attorney had produced his bar card, his driver's license, and the homeowner herself, who confirmed she had hired him to handle her estate planning. Complaint filed, resolved with a note in Delano's file, and mandatory completion of an online diversity awareness module. The second complaint arrived 8 months later. A black nurse walking from her parked car to a friend's house in Green Hills was stopped by Delano, who accused her of attempting to break into vehicles on the street. She was on her way to a birthday party. Her friend came outside and verified the invitation. Complaint filed, resolved with a verbal counseling session documented in Delano's personnel file. The third complaint came just 4 months after the second. A black landscaping crew working on a property in Forest Hills was confronted by Delano, who demanded to see work orders and threatened to arrest them for trespassing. The homeowner emerged, confirmed he had hired the crew, and expressed outrage at the disruption to his lawn maintenance. Complaint filed, resolved with Delano's mandatory attendance at a community relations workshop. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to look at it clearly. Black people in white neighborhoods. Delano assumes criminal intent. Delano confronts, questions, demands proof of legitimate presence. Complaints are filed. Training is assigned. Nothing actually changes. Fourth complaint. A black real estate appraiser photographing a home's exterior for a refinancing evaluation. Delano demanded credentials and detained him until the homeowner drove over from work to verify the appointment. Fifth complaint. A black college student home for winter break, walking to a convenience store from his parents' house. Delano stopped him 3 blocks from his own front door and questioned whether he actually lived in the neighborhood. Sixth complaint. A black woman sitting in her parked car waiting to pick up her daughter from a playdate. Delano approached with his hand on his service weapon and demanded she explain her presence on the street. 7 complaints in 5 years, an average of nearly 1.5 complaints per year, every single one following the same pattern, every single one involving a black person whose only offense was existing in a space that Delano had mentally designated as white territory. The Nashville Metropolitan Police Department had a file documenting every one of these incidents. The pattern was visible to anyone who cared to connect the dots, but the department's internal review processes treated each complaint as an isolated event, evaluating it on its individual merits without reference to the larger picture that was emerging. Supervisors signed off on completed training requirements. Human Resources updated personnel files, and Delano continued patrolling, continued questioning, continued assuming. So when dispatch relayed the call about a suspicious person on Whitland Avenue that Saturday morning, Delano responded with his usual confidence. This was what he did. This was what he was good at: protecting property, maintaining order, keeping these neighborhoods safe from people who did not belong. He turned onto Whitland Avenue and immediately observed what the caller had described: a black woman standing beside a mailbox in the driveway of an elegant colonial home. The scene did not compute according to the categories operating in Delano's mind. Whitland Avenue, expensive house, black woman. Something must be wrong. He did not pause to consider that the woman might own the property. He did not reflect on the demographic changes that had occurred in Nashville's historic neighborhoods over the past several decades. He did not question the caller's assumption that the rightful owner of this home must necessarily be white. He simply responded according to his established pattern: observe black person in white neighborhood, assume they do not belong, initiate contact. Delano pulled his patrol car to the curb, positioning it so that it partially blocked the driveway. He stepped out, adjusted his equipment belt, and began walking toward the woman. His right hand moved instinctively toward his radio, ready to call for backup if this encounter turned into something more than a simple property check. Do you believe police officers should be required to verify property ownership through official records before confronting anyone on private residential property? I would genuinely like to know your thoughts on this. Share them in the comments. And let us continue with what happened next. Evelyn had just finished sorting her mail into 2 stacks, items requiring attention and items destined for the recycling bin, when she heard the distinctive sound of a car door closing with more force than a casual visitor would typically use. She turned toward the street and felt her stomach tighten when she saw the police cruiser, the Nashville Metro Police emblem on the door, the light bar on the roof. The officer walking toward her with that particular stride she recognized from decades of Navig the words, but for a moment they did not make sense. Step away from the property. Her property. The property she had purchased 14 years ago with money earned through 3 decades of medical practice. Quote, her voice was calm, professional, the tone she used when delivering difficult news to patients and their families. Quote 1. Delano's expression did not change. We received a call reporting a suspicious person at this address. The caller indicated that the homeowner is not present and that you may be trespassing. The caller is mistaken. Evelyn kept her voice steady, though she could feel anger beginning to build beneath her professional composure. I am the homeowner. I have lived in this house for 14 years. My name is Dr. Evelyn Chambers, and I am a pulmonary physician at Vanderbilt. She watched something flicker across the officer's face. Skepticism, disbelief, something that suggested her words had not registered as truth in his mind. Quote 5. He pronounced the word with a slight emphasis that transformed it into something almost mocking. Quote 6. This is the moment when assumptions crystallize into accusations, when the filter through which someone views the world becomes so distorted that documented reality cannot penetrate it. Officer Marcus Delano had responded to a call from a neighbor who had made a presumption based entirely on race. That neighbor had never met Evelyn, had never spoken with her, had never had any direct knowledge of who owned this property. But that neighbor had seen a black woman in the driveway of an expensive home and had immediately concluded that she must not belong there. And Delano, instead of questioning that assumption, instead of recognizing it for the racially motivated speculation it so obviously was, had absorbed it completely, had made it his own, had arrived at this address prepared to remove a black woman from property that in his mind she could not possibly own. Quote 7. Evelyn's voice remained controlled, but an edge had entered it. If you need to verify my ownership, I encourage you to check the county property records. My name is on the deed. Evelyn Chambers. I purchased this house in 2009. I pay property taxes on this house every year. I am a professor of medicine at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. I have lived in Nashville my entire life. Delano shifted his weight slightly. I'm going to need you to step back toward the street while I verify your claims. Her claims. The word landed like a slap. Her claims to her own home. Her claims to property she had purchased outright, with money earned through decades of saving lives. Her claims to stand in her own driveway on a Saturday morning, sorting through her own mail. My claims. She held up the stack of envelopes in her hand, fanning them out so that the addresses were visible. Look at this mail, officer. Every single piece is addressed to Dr. Evelyn Chambers at 3847 Whitland Avenue. Because this is my house. Because I am Dr. Evelyn Chambers. Because I live here. Delano's eyes moved to the mail briefly, then back to her face. His expression had hardened, whether from embarrassment at the evidence contradicting his assumptions or from determination to maintain his authority. Despite that evidence, his tone became more aggressive. Quote 12. Something in Evelyn shifted. The anger that had been building broke through the surface of her professional composure, not in shouting, not in threatening words, but in a clarity that refused to be diminished. Quote 13. She pointed toward the house behind her. Quote 14. She held up the hospital ID, its photograph clearly visible. Quote 15. Delano's hand moved from his radio to his belt, closer to his handcuffs. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to step toward the street. And I am going to tell you one more time that I will not leave my own property. You have no legal basis for ordering me to do so. I am not trespassing. I am not committing any crime. I am collecting my mail at my own house on a Saturday morning. If you want to verify my ownership, check the Davidson County Property Records database. It is accessible on your mobile data terminal. My name will appear as the owner of record for this address. A car had slowed as it passed, its elderly white driver observing the scene with obvious curiosity. Evelyn saw him take note of the police cruiser, the officer's aggressive stance, the black woman standing with her mail in hand. He pulled to the curb just past the driveway and rolled down his window. Quote 18. Delano turned, his posture shifting slightly to address this new presence. Quote 19. But the man did not continue. He squinted at Evelyn, and recognition crossed his features. Quote 20. He turned his gaze to Evelyn, concern evident in his voice. Quote 21. Evelyn felt a complex mixture of emotions wash through her. Gratitude that someone in this neighborhood knew her, recognized her, was willing to speak on her behalf. Frustration that she needed someone to speak on her behalf at all. Exhaustion at the familiar pattern of needing a white person to validate her existence in white spaces. Quote 22. Patterson's face shifted through several expressions. Confusion, then understanding, then something that looked very much like shame on behalf of whichever neighbor had made that call. That is absolutely absurd. He addressed Delano directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Officer, Dr. Chambers has been a resident of this street for over a decade. She is one of the most respected physicians in Nashville. Check your records if you don't believe it, but do not stand here treating her like a criminal when she is simply collecting her mail. He gave Evelyn a nod of solidarity, then drove off slowly, his head shaking in visible disgust. Delano watched the car disappear around the corner. When he turned back to Evelyn, something had shifted in his demeanor. The absolute certainty had wavered, but his pride remained intact, and with it, his determination to maintain control of this encounter. I still need to verify ownership before I can clear the call. Then verify it. Evelyn did not move. Call your supervisor, access the property records, do whatever you need to do. But I am not stepping off my own property because an anonymous caller made assumptions about who is allowed to live on this street. And I am not going to be treated like a suspect for the crime of checking my mail. Delano reached for his radio, his jaw tight with something that might have been frustration or embarrassment. Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I need a supervisor at 3847 Whitland Avenue, also requesting a property record check on this address. The radio crackled an acknowledgement. Evelyn remained where she was, her mail still in her hand, her hospital badge still hanging from her neck, her dignity battered but unbroken. The next several minutes passed in tense silence. Delano stood near his cruiser, arms crossed, occasionally glancing at Evelyn with an expression that seemed to be searching for something he could use to justify his initial approach. Evelyn remained on her driveway, refusing to retreat, refusing to be moved from property that belonged to her in every legal and moral sense. A second patrol car arrived approximately 8 minutes after Delano's radio call. The woman who emerged was older, probably early 50s, with sergeant's stripes on her sleeves and gray threading through her dark hair. Sergeant Victoria Harding had served with the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department for 26 years. In that time, she had witnessed enough to recognize immediately what kind of situation she was stepping into. She approached and took in the scene with experienced eyes. A well-maintained colonial home, a woman standing calmly with mail in her hands, a hospital ID badge visible around her neck, a patrol car partially blocking the driveway. No signs of criminal activity, no signs of anything except a call that should never have been made and a response that should have ended much differently. Delano, report. Anonymous call about a suspicious person. Subject claims to be the homeowner, but the caller specified that the owner is a white family. I was attempting to verify. Harding held up a hand, cutting him off. Did you check the property records before approaching this woman? A pause. No, Sergeant. I was responding to the call as dispatched. The call that made assumptions about who should or should not be living at this address based on their race. Delano's face flushed slightly. Quote 34. Quote 35. Harding turned to Evelyn, her voice taking on a different tone, apologetic, professional, but carrying something that sounded like genuine regret. Quote 36. Evelyn met her gaze. Quote 37. Harding had already pulled out her department-issued smartphone. Her fingers moved across the screen, accessing the Davidson County Property Records database that was available to every officer in the field. Quote 38. She read from the screen. Quote 39. She looked up. Quote 40. She turned to Delano with an expression that barely contained her frustration. Quote 41. Delano's voice had lost its earlier confidence. Sergeant. The caller was specific about, the caller was wrong, and you should have verified the facts before confronting a homeowner on her own property and ordering her to leave. Harding's voice hardened. Quote 44. She turned back to Evelyn. Quote 45. Evelyn looked at Delano, then at Harding. The anger had settled into something colder, something more exhausted. Quote 46. Her voice remained steady, but it carried the weight of accumulated indignity. Quote 47. A third neighbor had emerged from across the street, a white woman who appeared to be in her early 70s. She walked toward the gathering with an expression of concern. Quote 48. Harding addressed her. Quote 49. The woman looked confused. Quote 50. Quote 51. The neighbor looked at Evelyn with something like horror dawning in her eyes. Quote 52. Evelyn nodded slowly. Quote 53. Should neighbors face legal consequences for filing police reports based on nothing more than racial assumptions about who should live on their street? I want to hear what you think about this. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Harding spoke into her radio. Quote 54. The radio acknowledged. Harding turned to Delano with an expression that left no room for negotiation. Quote 55. Delano's face went pale. Sergeant, I was responding to a dispatched call. I followed procedure. You followed your assumptions. You confronted a homeowner on her own property. You ordered her to leave. You had no legal basis for any of that. And this is your 7th complaint in 5 years. All 7 following the same pattern. All 7 involving black residents in white neighborhoods. She extended her hand. Badge, radio, sidearm. You are on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a full internal affairs investigation. You will not patrol. You will not wear this uniform. You will not carry a weapon. You will go home and wait for the investigation to conclude. Delano's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge from his uniform shirt. He removed the radio from his belt. He unholstered his service weapon, ejected the magazine, and cleared the chamber before handing it over. His law enforcement career, such as it was, had just been effectively suspended. Harding secured the equipment and addressed Evelyn again. Quote 59. Evelyn nodded, but her expression suggested that apologies, however sincere, were not sufficient. Quote 60. Harding met her gaze and held it. Quote 61. By that evening, Evelyn had contacted an attorney who specialized in civil rights litigation. By Monday morning, local news stations were broadcasting variations of the same story. Pulmonary specialist confronted by police on her own property. Nashville officer questions black homeowner's right to be in her driveway. Physician ordered to leave property she has owned for 14 years. The story spread across social media with the velocity that only cases of obvious injustice can achieve. Within hours, it had been picked up by national news outlets. The hashtag #JusticeForDarChambers began trending. Evelyn's photograph appeared alongside headlines questioning how an officer with 7 prior complaints had remained on patrol. The medical community rallied immediately. Vanderbilt University Medical Center released a statement expressing unequivocal support for Dr. Chambers and condemning the incident as an outrageous example of racial profiling. The Tennessee Medical Association issued its own statement of solidarity. Colleagues who had worked alongside Evelyn for decades shared their experiences of a physician who had dedicated her life to patient care, who had mentored countless younger doctors, who had earned respect through competence and compassion rather than through credentials alone. Her patients began reaching out, sharing their stories. An elderly man whose life she had saved during a severe pneumonia crisis, a young mother who credited Evelyn with diagnosing her rare pulmonary condition when other doctors had dismissed her symptoms, a fellow physician who had trained under her supervision and now ran his own successful practice. Story after story of a woman who had dedicated her career to healing others, now facing public humiliation for the crime of collecting her mail. Civil rights organizations mobilized. The local chapter of the NAACP called for immediate accountability. The ACLU of Tennessee documented the incident as part of a broader pattern of racial profiling in affluent Nashville neighborhoods. Community activists organized a press conference on the steps of the Metro Nashville courthouse, demanding systemic reform. 3 weeks after the incident, Evelyn filed a lawsuit in federal court. The named defendants included Officer Marcus Delano, his direct supervisors who had failed to address 7 complaints, and the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department itself. The legal claims were specific and damaging. Racial profiling in violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, unlawful detention, harassment, violation of Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable seizure, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and deliberate indifference by the department to Delano's documented pattern of discriminatory conduct. The complaint attached as exhibits Delano's complete personnel file, 7 complaints in 5 years, every single one involving a black individual in a predominantly white neighborhood, every single one resolved with training that clearly had no effect. The pattern was undeniable. The department's failure to recognize and address it was indefensible. Nashville's city attorneys reviewed the evidence and understood immediately the position they were in. Property records proved ownership beyond any doubt. Witness statements corroborated every element of Evelyn's account. Delano had no legal basis whatsoever for ordering a homeowner to leave her own property. The pattern of complaints demonstrated that the department had been on notice of his biased behavior for years and had done essentially nothing to stop it. Initial settlement discussions began within 2 months. The city's insurers recognized that a jury trial would likely result in a verdict far exceeding any negotiated settlement. Evelyn's attorneys pushed for not only financial compensation, but also systemic reforms that would prevent similar incidents in the future. The settlement was finalized 16 months after the incident. Nashville agreed to pay Dr. Evelyn Chambers $3.2 million, among the largest settlements in the city's history, for an unlawful detention on private property. The agreement also required the department to implement specific policy changes, though those provisions remained confidential at the city's insistence. Officer Marcus Delano was terminated 12 weeks after the driveway confrontation. The termination letter obtained later through public records requests was unambiguous in its findings. Officer Delano engaged in racial profiling of a homeowner on private property. He ordered Dr. Chambers to leave her own driveway, based entirely on an unverified anonymous call that made assumptions about the property owner's race. He failed to conduct basic verification procedures before confronting a citizen. His pattern of similar conduct, documented through 7 complaints over 5 years, demonstrates a persistent inability to serve the public without racial bias. His employment with the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department is terminated effective immediately. Delano's name was entered into the National Decertification Index, the database that tracks law enforcement officers who have been fired for misconduct. His 5-year career in policing was over. No other department in the country would hire him, knowing that his termination was recorded in that database. The police union attempted to challenge the termination through the grievance process established in the collective bargaining agreement. City attorneys responded by providing the union's representatives with Delano's complete personnel file, all witness statements from the incident, the property records proving Evelyn's ownership, and a detailed analysis of how his conduct had exposed the city to massive liability. The union reviewed the evidence and quietly withdrew its grievance. There was nothing to defend. Delano himself issued a brief statement through his personal attorney. I made serious errors in judgment and allowed assumptions to guide my actions in ways that caused harm. I have apologized to Dr. Chambers and accept responsibility for my conduct. The statement satisfied no one. It acknowledged errors without explaining how an officer could make the same error 7 times. It accepted responsibility without addressing the department's failure to intervene after complaints 1 through 6. It apologized without offering any insight into how someone could look at a physician standing in her own driveway and see a criminal. 4 months after the settlement was finalized, Evelyn Chambers testified before the Nashville Metropolitan Council. The council chamber was packed with residents, journalists, and city officials. Television cameras lined the back wall. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Evelyn approached the microphone with the same composure she brought to every aspect of her professional life. She wore a simple navy dress. Her hospital badge was notably absent, a deliberate choice. She was not appearing as Dr. Chambers, the respected physician. She was appearing as Evelyn Chambers, the homeowner, the citizen, the human being who had been dehumanized in her own driveway. Quote, 63. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber's sound system. I have been a physician for 32 years. I have dedicated my professional life to helping people breathe. When your lungs are failing, when you cannot draw air into your body, when you are drowning in fluid that your own body is producing, I am the doctor you need. I have sat with dying patients at every hour of the day and night. I have delivered the worst news imaginable to families who trusted me to save their loved ones. I have trained the next generation of pulmonologists to carry on this work when I am gone. She paused, letting the weight of her career settle into the room. I bought my house with money I earned through decades of this work, money earned through 90-hour weeks and missed family gatherings and holidays spent in intensive care units instead of at dinner tables with loved ones. I paid cash for that house because I did not want to owe anyone anything. I wanted a sanctuary, a place where I could rest after days of holding life and death in my hands. Her voice hardened slightly, and Officer Marcus Delano told me to leave my own driveway because someone called and said the homeowner should be white because he could not look at a black woman standing in front of an expensive home and see anything other than someone who did not belong. She let that statement hang in the air. 7 complaints in 5 years, all involving black residents in white neighborhoods. That is not bad luck. That is not a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. That is a pattern that your police department documented in his personnel file, a pattern that supervisors noted in his performance reviews, a pattern that resulted in nothing more than training modules that he completed and immediately ignored. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of council members who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This city paid $3.2 million to settle my lawsuit. That money came from Nashville taxpayers, which means it came in part from me. I contributed to the settlement of my own case through the taxes I pay every year. There is a bitter irony in that, but it is not the point. She leaned slightly toward the microphone. The point is this. The money does not undo what happened. It does not erase the humiliation of having neighbors watch while I proved that I owned my own house. It does not heal the violation of being ordered off property that I purchased with my life's work. And it does not protect the next black homeowner who will face the next officer with 7 complaints who is still patrolling because your department cannot be bothered to connect obvious dots. She straightened. $3 million is what it costs to finally address one officer's 5-year pattern of racial profiling. How many others are still out there? How many files contain 5 complaints, 6 complaints, 7 complaints that your department treats as isolated incidents rather than what they obviously are? How many black citizens have to prove they belong in their own homes before something actually changes? The chamber was silent. I am asking you to implement reforms that make what happened to me impossible, mandatory property record verification before any accusation of trespassing on residential property, automatic internal affairs investigation when an officer reaches 3 similar complaints, pattern recognition as departmental policy, not as an afterthought when lawsuits pile up. She gathered her notes, preparing to conclude. I dedicated my life to helping people survive. I should be able to collect my mail without having to survive my police department. Nashville implemented reforms 8 months after Evelyn's testimony. The new policies included mandatory property record verification before any trespassing-related confrontation on private residential property, automatic internal investigation triggered by any officer receiving 3 complaints within a 3-year period involving similar conduct, body camera footage review for all residential encounters, a community liaison program designed to connect patrol officers with the diverse residents of the neighborhoods they served, clear command accountability for supervisors who failed to address documented patterns in officer conduct. Whether these reforms would survive contact with the realities of police culture and union resistance remained to be seen. Whether they would actually protect the next Evelyn Chambers remained an open question, but they represented at least an acknowledgement that something had been deeply wrong, that the old ways of treating each complaint as isolated had failed catastrophically. Why do police departments consistently treat repeated complaints as separate incidents rather than recognizing the obvious patterns they form? I am curious what you think about this. Share your perspective in the comments below. This story was never really about one Saturday morning. It was about a system that allowed Marcus Delano to accumulate 7 complaints documenting the exact same discriminatory behavior without anyone connecting them into the pattern they so obviously formed. The complaints were documented, the pattern was visible, but Nashville's police department treated each incident as a separate event, evaluating it in isolation, resolving it with training that changed nothing, and sending Delano back onto patrol to do exactly the same thing to the next black person he encountered in a white neighborhood. 7 complaints in 5 years. 7 people confronted, questioned, detained, humiliated for the crime of being black in spaces where someone with a badge and a gun had decided they did not belong. How many of those 7 had the resources to fight back? How many had the professional credentials to wave in an officer's face? How many had neighbors willing to vouch for them, attorneys ready to take their cases, news outlets interested in their stories? Dr. Evelyn Chambers was in many ways the perfect victim, if victim is even the right word. She had undeniable credentials. She had irrefutable documentation of ownership. She had witnesses. She had resources. She had the ability to withstand the stress of litigation and the attention of media coverage. The system that failed her was exposed precisely because she had the tools to expose it. But what about victims 1 through 6? What about the attorney who was questioned while visiting a client? What about the nurse stopped on her way to a birthday party? What about the landscaping crew threatened with arrest while performing legitimate work? What about all the people who were confronted by Marcus Delano, who filed complaints? Who watched those complaints disappear into a bureaucratic process designed to protect officers rather than citizens? They did not get $3.2 million. They did not get policy reforms named in their honor. They got diversity awareness modules and community relations workshops and a system that learned nothing from their experiences. They got an officer who remained on patrol, empowered by his badge to continue assuming that black people did not belong in white spaces. Marcus Delano's career is over. That is consequence. He is in the National Decertification Index. He will never wear a badge again. His 5 years of racially motivated policing concluded in termination and public disgrace. But that consequence came after 7 complaints, after 5 years of the same behavior, after untold hours of humiliation inflicted on citizens whose only offense was existing while black in neighborhoods that someone decided should be white. The city paid $3.2 million. That is accountability of a sort. The money came from public coffers, from taxpayers who had no role in Delano's conduct, but who will bear the financial burden of his discrimination and the department's willful blindness. But money does not undo harm. It does not erase the memory of being ordered off your own property. It does not heal the psychological wound of having your neighbors watch while you prove you have a right to exist in your own home. It does not restore the sense of safety and belonging that was stolen. The real question, the question that this story demands we ask, is what changes now? Do departments start connecting the dots at complaint 3 instead of waiting until complaint 7? Do they implement systems that recognize patterns when officers repeatedly target the same demographic in the same context? Do they prioritize protecting citizens over protecting officers whose files document undeniable bias? Because if we do not address the systemic failures that kept Marcus Delano patrolling for 5 years through 7 identical complaints, if we do not change the culture that treats pattern recognition as optional, then we are simply waiting. Waiting for the next officer with 7 complaints, waiting for the next victim, waiting for the next physician who is told to leave her own driveway because someone cannot believe that a black woman could possibly belong there. Do you think a policy requiring automatic investigation and potential termination after 3 similar complaints within 3 years should be mandatory nationwide? I genuinely want to know your position on this. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe these stories matter, if you think 7 complaints over 5 years should have resulted in action long before complaint 7, then I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel. We are committed to exposing departments that ignore obvious patterns, to demanding better from the institutions that are supposed to protect us, and to fighting for homeowners who deserve to exist on their own property without having to prove they belong. This was never about one officer or one doctor. It was about systems that allow patterns to continue unchecked and about the citizens who pay the price for that institutional blindness. The patterns will not break themselves. Someone has to break them. And sometimes that breaking begins with a story, told clearly, shared widely, and refused to be forgotten. Dr. Evelyn Chambers still lives in her house on Whitland Avenue. She still practices medicine at Vanderbilt. She still walks to her mailbox several times a week to collect her correspondence. But something changed on that Saturday morning, something that no settlement can restore and no policy reform can fully address. She lost, for a moment, the simple peace of standing in her own driveway without wondering who might be watching, who might be calling, who might be deciding that she does not belong in the space she has rightfully earned. She lost the ability to assume that her decades of work, her credentials, her contributions to her community would protect her from the assumption that her presence was itself suspicious. That loss is immeasurable, and it is shared by every Black American who has ever been questioned, challenged, detained, or confronted in spaces they have every right to occupy. The settlement provided financial compensation. The termination provided a measure of justice. The reforms provided hope that perhaps the next victim might be protected. But the larger question remains unanswered, hanging in the air like the final note of a song that has no proper resolution. When will we live in a country where a physician can collect her mail without proving she belongs? When will a badge be wielded as a tool of protection rather than a weapon of assumption? When will the pattern finally, irrevocably break? These are the questions that this story leaves us with. They are questions that demand answers not from any single officer or department or city, but from all of us, from the systems we create and maintain, from the assumptions we allow to persist unchallenged, from the willingness we summon or fail to summon to see each other clearly without the filters of prejudice and presumption. Dr. Evelyn Chambers deserved better. The 6 victims before her deserved better. We all deserve better than a system that requires 7 complaints before it recognizes what was obvious from the very first one. This story matters. May we remember it. May we learn from it. May we demand that it never needs to be repeated.